So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about fabric and what I do before I do any sewing project. Now I've bought this fabric. It is a polycotton. Polycotton is fine to use. Also, you can also use a ordinary just plain cotton, but any fabric really. But if you're just going to be starting off, I would suggest just trying a piece of either polycotton or cotton. I got this one and it was reasonably cheap. I got it from a shop called Treagle Mills, which is down in this part of the country, but we won't find that everywhere. I used a yard and I managed to get 4 dresses out of it, 2 hair slides and 2 embellishments, and I've got this much fabric left. So that's worked really well for me, the way I've put it on the fabric. Now what you need to look for is when you're looking at your fabric is, if you look, this is all going in the same direction. Now if you were making a dress out of this, you would have to make sure everything you put onto it, your bodice, your skirt, everything was facing this way. You might get other patterns which say if it just had a flower, no petals or anything, you could have your pattern paper any way you wanted it and it wouldn't matter. But with this, it has to just go in that direction. On your pattern, you should find a line and it points with a point on one end, and then you have a line coming down the middle and then a point on that end, and that is the way the grain of your fabric goes. And as you can see, mine is going in this direction. So when you look at it very closely, you can see the grain coming along here. So that's the way the grain would go. So what you want to do is lay your fabric out. Now always iron your fabric before you start doing it, because if you've got a piece which is rumpled up, say a bit like that, and then you try and put your pattern on the top of it and you cut it like that, when you take it out, you'll see that piece there which was rumpled, that isn't going to lay flat. You're going to have a bigger piece here. So if you cut the sleeve there, that sleeve's going to be much bigger than that sleeve there. So you need to make sure your fabric is nice and flat. I like to starch my fabric. I just use a simple starch, the cheapest you can get. You can get it in Poundland and places like that. Spray it on, and then I would spray the starch in here. Get it nice and damp all over that. Leave it for a minute or two, then rub your hand along it, then put your piece of fabric back over, and then just rub your hands across and then turn it over. But what you have to remember if you do that is that you will have to clean your iron. So you'll have to wait for your iron to cool, clean it before you start coming to do the pieces on your dress, because otherwise you'll find that your iron, it will make marks onto your dress. So this is my fabric, and I think this was a 45 width. So that would be how much that is from there to there, from this end to this end. Now if you have a look, I'm just going to show you this piece of the end of the fabric. I don't know if you can see, there's little tiny holes in it. You do not want to use this at all. You want to put your pattern here, away from that. Don't ever go like that, because this piece of the fabric, I don't know if you can see, it's really stiff. It doesn't move like this would move. This is soft and it would move nicely. So you don't want to use that end of your fabric there. So that's the fabrics. And then when you lay it down, whenever you lay your fabric down to put the pattern pieces on it, don't do it on a ironing board, because the ironing board moves around. You want your when you're pinning stuff onto it, you want it on a nice flat surface. Also, whilst you're moving along with your scissors, quite often, as you can see, it moves off and you can catch that ironing board cover, and you end up having to buy new ironing board covers. So that's that. So that's about my material. Then I'm going to go on to my scissors. Now these are dressmaking scissors and they are quite expensive. I think you're going to pay about £8 maybe for the pair like this. you want to buy a new pair of dressmaking scissors, and you need to buy a decent quality. This is going to be the number one thing which you're going to be using for your dressmaking. Only ever use it for cutting the fabric, never use it to cut your patterns or anything else like that. Just use it for that. They're brilliant. I've had these 20, maybe 30 years, and they're still absolutely fantastic. They cut really well. You know, I'm still right to the end. You can cut tiny snips with them still at the ends, you know. So if you did get them and you find that they were starting to blunt, you can always cut up pieces of tin foil and that will sharpen them. But as I say, if you can get a decent pair, that's what I would do. And then I use this Isochord thread. I find it works absolutely fantastic. There are places on eBay where you can get it reasonably cheaply, and I can there's nothing to do with me. I will see if I can find a link of where I had it before, but I'm not sure whether I will be able to. This is brilliant. I use this for embroidery when I'm embroidering on the sewing machine, and I also use it for my normal sewing, because if you have a look, it's really strong. It won't break easily. So when you're running your stuff through the sewing machine, if you've got a cheaper thread, you'll find that it's constantly breaking, having to rethread your needle all the time, which is such a pain when you're working on it. So I love this cord, this thread. It's really good. And then the pins, well, I would just use the pins with the little balls on the head. Okay, I do have some of the other ones, just the plain pins. There's one there. I'm going to get it out to show you. Okay, now I find when you're trying to push that into the fabric, that really hurts your finger. Whereas if you're trying to push that in, you can see there's no sort of like, there's not that big indentation there was with the other. This hurts. That's quite soft. Okay, so I would just use those type. If you're going to start off and you're going to buy something to start you off, I would buy those. Okay, and then your needles. Now, if you're going to be doing a lot of sewing, you want to buy smaller needles, and I'm going to take you out and show you what I mean. These bigger needles here, can you see, they look good and you can thread them easily and whatever, but when you're using a bigger needle, pushing it through the thread, the fabric all the time and sewing with it, you'll find that your hands get quite tired and you get quite stiff using them. It's harder to make the small the little small stitches, especially if you're going to be doing something like a quilt or something like that. So I would recommend getting smaller needles, more like those. Okay, right, so that's basically all I use for when I'm sewing, apart from my mat. It's a 24-inch mat, because, and I also have a metric one, which is just down here at the moment, which is 57 centimeters by 42 centimeters. Okay, now the reason I tend to use this one a little bit more with the inches marked on it is because a lot of the quilting stuff is done in inches. So when I'm doing quilting and all that sort of stuff, when you're buying your fabric and that type of stuff, it just works out easier for me to use this one here. So I do a lot of my measurements in that. There's no particular reason. When I buy a ruler or something like that, you know, most of the rulers for quilting, they come out in inches, and that's just the way it is, because all that's been done for, I suppose, hundreds of years in inches. I do prefer to work in metric, but because of having the having to get the equipment for the quilting, unfortunately you have to use a lot of the inches stuff. A lot of the fabric, if it's pre-cut, comes in 12-inch, 10-inch, 8-inch squares, so that's why I use that more. So hopefully that's helped. So I just wanted to show you my sewing machine, and just tell you a little bit about it. If I was going to buy another sewing machine now, I would buy myself another expensive sewing machine very similar to this one. This one is, I wouldn't just go for a Singer. I'd look to see what was the best make on the market before I chose what I was going to have. This is a really good sewing machine, and it also does embroidery as well, so I use it an awful lot. I've enjoyed using it. I probably had this sewing machine, well, my sister's passed away 10 years ago, so she left this to me in her will, so I've had it at least 10 years, and then she probably had it 5 or 6 years before that, so it's had a good life, and it works really well. And it was well worth the investment, but it cost well over £1,000. Now for me that's fine, because I'm going to use it all the time. It's going to be something that's going to be used, you know, sort of day in, day out, at least once, twice, maybe even 3 times a week. So it's a good thing for me to have. I would say don't buy something like this if you're going just starting. I would say go on to somewhere like Facebook Marketplace or eBay or somewhere like that and get a cheap sewing machine. As long as it does straight stitches and zigzag stitches, that would be okay. If you're going to get it off Facebook Marketplace, you want to go and see and actually watch it working. Check it all out for yourself. If you're a child, never ever go to anybody's house to buy anything unless you have an adult with you. Always take an adult, and always be very careful when buying electrical appliances. You can get reconditioned sewing machines, which might be a good idea, but it's just looking and seeing what would be best for you to have. As you can see, my sewing machine does a needle up, needle down. It does a forward and backward stitch, and I've got lots of different stitches. What stitches do I use? I use the straight stitch and I use the zigzag stitch. When I'm doing fancy sewing, which, you know, if I'm making a dress for my granddaughter or something, I will use these other stitches. This one does a buttonhole. I hardly ever use it. You know, I much prefer to use velcros or pop fasteners and things like that, so I don't really bother with that. Mine has different stitch lengths on it, and you can have your needle on left and right by moving it along there, and basically that's all you want. Something which does a straight stitch, something which does a zigzag. If you can get a back stitch on your sewing machine, that's great. That's all you need. You don't need anything complicated. So just a little bit about fabrics and how you can get them cheaply. Now, you can just get a polycotton like this. You're going to probably pay about £4 or £5 for a metre of that, but you're going to get, say, you'd get at least 3 dolls' dresses out of that, so that's not so bad. But what I would say is, if you go to a charity shop, you could get a piece like this, which is a skirt, which I've cut off. I paid £1 for this. This was enough to get 2 dresses, and I've still got this much fabric left out of it. This isn't a polycotton, this is a much thicker fabric. I don't know if you can see how thick that is. Yeah, so that's going to be a little bit different for cutting and doing it and working with, and also this frays a lot more than the other stuff would, so you're going to have to make sure that you do a double turn if you use a piece of fabric like this, but it will go through the machine and it will work really well. I would try to, if I'm going to buy second-hand clothes to make stuff out of, I would always try to look at the quality of it, read the label. If it's got a good label on it which says that it's 100% cotton or a polycotton or whatever, you know, that's going to be okay. You don't want anything which is a fabric for using curtains, and you don't want anything which is too thick, because that's going to not lay straight on the dolls. It'll sort of bunch up in odd ways. Okay, and then this was £1. This is a tree skirt to go around the bottom of a tree. It's a lovely fabric, and this will be really nice for Christmas, to make it maybe a Christmas dress or something with. I think this came from maybe Poundland or one of those sort of cheaper shops like that, so that's brand new. But this is going to be harder to sew with because it's a silky fabric, So you're going to have to take a lot more care when you're sewing it, because when you're moving that around, that is going to slide around on your sewing machine. So that's not going to be as easy as working with a poly cotton or a cotton. This is a man's shirt I've cut up. As you can see, it's quite a nice stripy fabric. If I was going to make something for one of my boys' dolls, that would work really well. Can you see how big that's the back? You know, you're going to get a big, you could get a dress out there, you could get a shirt out there, you can get a jacket. You can pay, you know, £1, £1.50, something like that. You don't have to pay a great deal of that for that. Make sure you get something which isn't too worn, and have a look at the fabric. This is 100% cotton, and that's what I would recommend to buy if you're going to be buying for your dolls second hand, because if you look at this, you'll find that there's no bubbling on it, and cotton is like that. You can get a nice flats, it doesn't bubble up like the poly cotton does. Poly cotton it's a polyester and cotton mixed together. So that's what it's called, that. Another thing you can get is this, and it's got poplin in it, and if you can have a look, can you see how stretchy that is? I wouldn't recommend that if you're just starting out. It's a lovely fabric. It's 100%, 95% cotton and 5% of this poplin, I think it's called, and it's, as you can see, it's really stretchy, so it's a little bit more difficult to work with. So if you're just starting off, don't go for something like that. But as you can see, that was a skirt, so I'm going to have at least sort of this much fabric all the way over here, say, and then it's going to come over here, and you can see how much fabric you could get out of one skirt, so you don't have to sort of spend too much on it. The other type of fabric that I sometimes use is a t-shirt fabric. This was like a dress, a long dress, so a maxi dress, so you can see how much fabric you're going to get out of that. But the only thing I would say, this again is really hard to work with if you're just starting. You can't sew this with a single stitch, you have to do it with a very small zigzag, because this is really stretchy. You know what your t-shirts are like yourself, so I wouldn't go for that if you're just starting out. We will be doing stuff on making t-shirts and that type of thing later, so you can always do that. Also, things which you can be looking for when you're picking up dresses and that is embellishments. So you might find something with a nice embellishment on it which you could use again.